What if the fairy tale of Diana Spencer, the shy young girl who became the people's princess, was not a fairy tale at all, but the final chapter in a story drenched in betrayal, forbidden love, and blood? For generations, the world believed Diana entered the royal family as an outsider, a commoner elevated into royalty. But that narrative conceals a darker truth. Diana's lineage was not an intrusion into the monarchy. It was a return. A bloodline thought extinguished centuries earlier had quietly survived, waiting, hidden inside the Spencer family tree. To uncover it, we must journey back 5 centuries, to the reign of Henry VIII, a king whose name is forever tied to beheaded queens, shattered vows, and dynastic terror. The history books tell us the Tudor line ended with Elizabeth I, the virgin queen who left no heir. But history, as often happens, left out the shadows, the whispers, the inconvenient truths. One of those truths begins not in the glitter of English coronation halls, but in the cold stone corridors of a French palace, where a young English princess was bartered away like a pawn. Her name was Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, not Bloody Mary, the queen who would later burn Protestants at the stake, but another Mary. She was radiant, her beauty famed across Europe, golden red hair, pale luminous skin, eyes that could soften or ignite with equal force. Her brother adored her. He called her his Pearl of England. Yet pearls, however treasured, can be locked away. In 1514, Henry, still early in his reign, used Mary as a bargaining chip. For England's fragile alliance with France, he arranged her marriage to King Louis XII, an aging, ailing monarch more than 3 decades her senior. Mary was just 18. Imagine her, full of life and spirit, walking into the rigid etiquette of a foreign court, surrounded by suspicious courtiers whispering behind their jeweled hands. A guard once told his son that the sound of Mary's laughter was the only warmth in that frigid palace. But it was a laughter that barely lasted a season. Louis XII died after only 82 days of marriage. Mary was suddenly a widow, and for a fleeting moment, she tasted freedom. But for a princess, freedom was an illusion. Henry, as king, would decide her next marriage. She was not his sister in his mind, but his instrument, one more pawn on the chessboard of European politics. Yet Mary carried a secret, a promise made before she ever crossed the Channel. She had fallen in love with Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, Henry's closest friend and confidant. He was no royal, but his star at court was rising, and he held both ambition and charm in equal measure. Before Mary was shipped to France, they swore a dangerous vow: if she ever became a widow, she would choose her second husband herself. She would choose Charles. It was an oath made in defiance of a king. And defying Henry VIII was often a death sentence. When news of Louis's death reached England, Henry wasted no time. He dispatched Charles Brandon to escort Mary home. But beneath the seemingly innocent order was an unspoken threat. Henry knew of their affection. He pressed into Charles's hand a heavy golden signet ring and told him, "This is my faith in you. Do not betray it." It was trust weighted with menace. Picture Charles on the ship crossing the English Channel. The spray of seawater on his face, the wind tugging at his cloak, the gold ring burning in his pocket. He was being torn in two, between loyalty to the king who had elevated him, and love for the woman who had claimed his heart. Every wave crashing against the hull seemed to whisper of the scaffold. When he reached the French court, he found Mary cloaked in mourning, her chambers draped in velvet black. Yet when their eyes met, grief gave way to urgency. That night, Mary confronted him. She was no longer a timid girl. She had endured a loveless marriage and a foreign court. She had survived. Now she was steel-wrapped in silk. "Will you marry me?" she demanded. It was not a plea. It was an ultimatum. Charles hesitated. He warned her of Henry's wrath, of the Tower of London, of the executioner's axe that never stayed dull for long. He reminded her of Edmund de la Pole, executed simply for being a distant rival to Henry's throne. But Mary would not bend. "If you do not marry me now," she whispered with fire, "I will return to England, I will be forced into another marriage, and I will tell my brother it was you who refused me." It was masterful, half desperation, half manipulation. She left him trapped, condemned if he married her, condemned if he did not. And so, in a tiny chapel on the outskirts of Paris, lit by flickering candles, they defied the most powerful monarch in Europe. With a trembling old priest and a handful of anxious servants as witnesses, Charles slid a borrowed ring onto Mary's finger. At that instant, a gust of wind blasted the chapel doors open, extinguishing half the candles. Father Michel gasped at the omen. They were married, and they were doomed. The voyage back to England was a torment. Each creak of the timbers sounded like the grinding of the axe on its block. Each swell of the sea felt like Henry's rage, pounding against the ship. They could not eat. They barely slept. Letters were written and rewritten, pleas for mercy, offers of Mary's jewels and dowry, bargains for survival. Charles begged Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's brilliant but ruthless adviser, to intercede. Mary wrote to her brother of childhood promises, of their bond. But each word seemed too fragile to hold back the storm awaiting them. When their ship finally landed at Dover, the silence was more chilling than any shouted curse. No banners, no musicians, no cheering crowds. Only a handful of officials. One of them, Sir Giles, a man with eyes like a fish left too long in the market, refused to address Mary as Your Grace. Instead, he looked at Charles with contempt that bordered on pity. The message was unmistakable. You are no longer the king's friend. You are a traitor. Their journey from Dover to London should have been a triumphal procession. Instead, it was a death march. At every stop, they were confined like prisoners. Servants who once bowed deeply now whispered behind their hands. One stable boy, who had once idolized Charles Brandon, slipped a crude drawing beneath their door, a sketch of the Tower of London, with two figures standing on a scaffold. The implication was clear. England was waiting for their execution. When they finally reached London, there were no crowds. No shouts of anger. No applause. Just a suffocating silence. Mary and Charles were separated at once. She was locked in chambers dressed with silver platters and flowers, a velvet cage. Charles was led to a bare stone room with nothing but a barred window and his own gnawing thoughts. This was Henry's first move. Not the axe. Not the dungeon. Something worse. He gave them silence, thick and oppressive, until fear itself became their executioner. Weeks passed in a haze of dread. Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon waited for the inevitable, the king's judgment. In the silence of their separate confinements, fear gnawed at them like rats in the walls. Henry VIII, the man whose temper had already shaken courts across Europe, was not known for mercy. And this was no ordinary betrayal. This was family. This was friendship. This was humiliation. When Charles was finally summoned, it was not to the throne room filled with courtiers but to a small private study inside Greenwich Palace. The walls were lined with tapestries glorifying Henry's victories, mocking reminders of the monarch's power. Behind a massive oak desk sat Henry himself, cleaning his fingernails with a dagger, as if the fate of his sister and closest friend were a passing afterthought. He let Charles stand in silence, sweating through his doublet, before speaking in a voice almost gentle. "Charles," he said, "the man I raised from nothing. Did you really think I would not find out?" The words were velvet wrapped around steel. Henry reminded him of the law. To marry a princess without the king's consent was treason. And the punishment for treason was death. The king even mused, coldly, about the executioner who sharpened his axe each morning, sometimes asking his wife, "Who will it be today?" Henry's smile lingered like frost. Yet Henry was more cunning than cruel. To strike off Charles's head would end his usefulness. To keep him alive, indebted and broken, would ensure a lifetime of servitude. And so, instead of the scaffold, Henry devised a punishment that was both practical and theatrical. First came financial ruin. Mary and Charles were ordered to repay every penny of her French dowry. They were stripped of estates and forced to live with wealth in name only. Their fine clothes and feasts were maintained for appearance, but the reality was a household perpetually in debt, bound by obligations to the crown. Second came public humiliation. They were forced to remarry in front of the entire court, kneeling before Henry as though begging forgiveness. What had begun as a secret, defiant love story was paraded as submission, a carefully staged performance designed to reassert the king's supremacy. But the cruelest blow was reserved for their children. Henry decreed that their offspring would live only because he allowed it. They would carry no claim, no true titles, no hope of royal destiny. They would grow up under watchful eyes, their bloodline monitored as though it were a dangerous contagion. Charles left that meeting alive but hollow. He had entered fearing death and departed knowing he had condemned himself and his family to a subtler, more insidious form of execution, a lifetime chained to the crown's suspicion. Their life at Westhorpe Hall reflected that paradox. Outwardly, it was enviable. Grand feasts, glittering attire, children raised among tutors and nurses. Yet the hall was not a sanctuary but a velvet prison. Every servant might be a spy. Every guest could be a royal informer. Reports were sent regularly to London by Master Croft, their steward, loyal not to them, but to the king. Behind the laughter of banquets lurked the suffocating awareness that Henry was always listening. It was in this atmosphere of gilded suspicion that their children grew. The eldest, Frances Brandon, inherited her mother's fiery spirit. She was proud, sharp, and strong-willed. But like her parents, she was trapped in the Tudor web. When she came of age, her marriage was not her choice. The crown arranged her union with Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, a man respectable, but no romantic hero. To Frances, it was a cage draped in silks, a match engineered not for love but for control of the dangerous Tudor blood in her veins. Frances and Henry Grey had 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary Grey. Each would carry the burden of their lineage like a curse. But it was Jane, the eldest, brilliant and bookish, who would bear it most cruelly. Jane was unlike the other girls of her age. She preferred her tutor's lessons to courtly games, the study of theology over dances and silks. Letters from her contemporaries describe her as precocious, deeply devout, and astonishingly intelligent. Yet intelligence was a fragile shield in a world where crowns were traded like coins. By the mid-16th century, England was divided. Henry VIII was dead, leaving behind a fractured realm. His sickly son, Edward VI, ruled in name, but real power belonged to Protestant lords terrified of England falling into the hands of his Catholic half-sister, Mary Tudor. To block her path, they needed an alternative heir, someone with Tudor blood but Protestant faith. Jane Grey, just 16 years old, fit their plans perfectly. She begged for another life. She wanted her books, not a throne. But her parents, ambitious and fearful, allied with the Duke of Northumberland, forced her into a marriage with his son. It was a political calculation, a gamble of dynastic chess. Jane's tears meant nothing against the tide of ambition. And so, in July 1553, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England. She entered the Tower of London not as a prisoner but as a monarch. The crown, so heavy she could scarcely hold her head upright, was placed upon her. Courtiers bowed, but their loyalty was thin, brittle. In the silence of her chambers, Jane confided only in her books and the letters of her old tutor. Her reign was meant to last years. It lasted 9 days. The people rallied not to her, but to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter, whose claim was undeniable and whose following surged like wildfire. Within days, Jane was abandoned. Northumberland was executed. Her father was arrested. And Jane, still little more than a child, was left to await her fate. On a February morning in 1554, she looked from her tower window and saw her husband led to the scaffold. She watched as his headless body was carried back beneath her chambers. Hours later, it was her turn. She was just 17. Calm, dignified, she mounted the scaffold, blindfolded, hands trembling as she reached for the block. She could not find it. Panic cracked her composure. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she cried. A guard guided her hands to the cold wood. Moments later, the axe fell. With that blow, it seemed Henry VIII's vengeance had reached its grim conclusion. The forbidden marriage of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon had birthed a bloodline that stretched across generations, only to be extinguished in a girl's terrified cry and the thud of steel on flesh. But curses rarely die so neatly. And the bloodline was not finished yet. The execution of Lady Jane Grey should have been the full stop to a cursed bloodline. A final, brutal punctuation mark on a story that began with Mary Tudor's defiance in a Paris chapel. But bloodlines have a way of enduring, twisting themselves through history like roots beneath stone. Jane's sisters, Catherine Grey and Mary Grey, would carry the legacy forward, and they too would pay the price. Catherine, the middle sister, could not have been more different from Jane. Where Jane was solemn, studious, and devout, Catherine was vivacious, charming, and strikingly beautiful. She had none of Jane's appetite for theology, but she carried the same dangerous inheritance, Tudor blood. And under the reign of Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's last surviving child, that inheritance was lethal. Elizabeth, famously known as the Virgin Queen, refused to marry or name an heir. This decision left England in constant uncertainty, every faction scheming over who might inherit the throne when she died. Catherine Grey, as a senior descendant of Henry VII's younger daughter, was not just a noblewoman. She was a living alternative to Elizabeth herself. To many, she represented continuity. To Elizabeth, she represented a threat. Catherine understood the danger. She had watched her sister Jane die for a crown she never wanted. She should have hidden in the shadows, content with survival. But like her great-grandmother before her, she fell in love. His name was Edward Seymour, a man of high birth, grandson of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who had once ruled England as Lord Protector. Catherine and Edward married in secret, believing, perhaps naively, that love could exist beyond politics. It was a dangerous delusion. When Catherine's pregnancy became impossible to conceal, the secret was torn into the open. The scandal sent shockwaves through the court. Elizabeth's fury erupted like a storm. To her, this was no innocent romance. It was treason dressed as marriage. A potential rival heir had been produced without her consent, without her control. Elizabeth's punishment was not swift execution, that would have risked martyrdom. Instead, she devised something crueler. She declared Catherine's marriage invalid, her children illegitimate. Then she ordered Catherine imprisoned, shuttling her from one dreary castle to another, always under guard, always separated from her husband. The young couple's letters, desperate, smuggled scraps of affection, were intercepted and delivered to Elizabeth herself. Their words of love became instruments of torment. Catherine wasted away in captivity. The vibrant woman who once laughed easily grew pale and thin, consumed by grief. At just 27, she died, officially of illness, but in truth of a broken heart. She left behind 2 sons, but Elizabeth made sure their lives, too, were marked with stigma. They would grow up under suspicion, their legitimacy forever questioned, their Tudor blood treated as a curse rather than a blessing. The youngest sister, Mary Grey, seemed at first glance the least threatening. Born with dwarfism and a twisted spine, she was mocked at court, dismissed as harmless. Elizabeth, in her arrogance, believed Mary posed no danger. But blood will not be denied. Mary carried the same fire as her sisters, and she too dared to marry for love. Her choice was scandalous not for ambition, but for simplicity. She fell for Thomas Keyes, the Queen's sergeant porter, the man responsible for guarding the very palace gates. In rank, he was little more than a glorified doorman. To Elizabeth, this was not just an unsuitable match, it was an insult to royal dignity. A princess of Tudor blood, binding herself to a man of such low station, was a mockery of the crown. Mary was punished as her sister had been. She and her husband were separated almost immediately after their marriage. She spent the remainder of her life under house arrest, denied the companionship she had risked everything for. Thomas Keyes died before they could ever be reunited. Mary herself lived in obscurity, remembered not for power or beauty, but as yet another grey girl suffocated by a legacy she never asked for. What began as Mary Tudor's romantic rebellion against her brother Henry VIII had, within 2 generations, become a story of tragedy repeated. Jane, Catherine, Mary, 3 sisters bound by the same fate. Each carried the dangerous spark of Tudor blood. Each loved not for politics but for the heart. And each was punished for it, crushed by queens who could not forgive what they represented. The message from the crown was unmistakable: this bloodline will never be allowed to thrive. It would be imprisoned, humiliated, diluted into nothingness. And for a time, it worked. Catherine's children were declared illegitimate, their claims erased. Mary's line faded into quiet obscurity. The fiery legacy of Mary Tudor seemed at last extinguished. Yet history is patient. Bloodlines slip into shadows, waiting. Generations pass. Dynasties rise and fall. And sometimes, what kings and queens believe they have destroyed is only hidden, quietly surviving, waiting for the moment to resurface. For a time, it seemed the Grey sisters' fates had achieved what Henry VIII had wanted all along: the silencing of a bloodline that had dared to defy him. Catherine's children were cast aside, labeled illegitimate. Mary Grey faded into obscurity. The daughters and granddaughters of Mary Tudor were diluted into minor gentry, parish families, clergymen's wives. The fiery Tudor blood was thought smothered beneath centuries of ordinary lives. But blood has a way of persisting, flowing beneath the surface, weaving itself into the fabric of forgotten family trees. Dynasties shifted. Tudors gave way to Stuarts, Stuarts to Hanoverians. Monarchs came and went. And still, somewhere in the countryside, the Grey legacy continued, disguised, unremarked upon, quietly waiting. By the 17th and 18th centuries, their descendants had become the Spencers. Respectable, wealthy sheep farmers turned landowners. They built solid estates, married wisely, and cultivated a reputation for good business sense and stability. To most, they were successful but unremarkable, paragons of English gentry, not royalty. And yet, hidden deep in their family tree, the blood of Mary Tudor, Charles Brandon, Lady Jane Grey, and Catherine Grey still ran. The curse that had once toppled queens had not vanished. It had only gone quiet. Centuries later, in the 1960s, the Spencers produced a daughter. She was shy, gentle, and almost painfully ordinary in her early life. She worked as a kindergarten assistant, photographed by neighbors with tousled hair and a hesitant smile. Her name was Diana Frances Spencer. That middle name, Frances, carried weight. It was not chosen at random but passed down from Frances Brandon, daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, the very woman whose child, Lady Jane Grey, had died on the scaffold. Diana's family, whether consciously or not, had preserved that link for generations. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, the world saw it as a fairy tale, a commoner stepping into the dazzling, ancient institution of monarchy. The streets of London overflowed with cheering crowds. Television cameras carried her image into nearly 1 billion homes. The commentators called it romance, destiny, a modern Cinderella story. But beneath the veil and diamonds, history itself was laughing. Diana was no outsider. She was the return of a bloodline thought destroyed. She carried Tudor blood back into the very heart of the crown that had once tried to erase it. And that irony cuts deeper the more one reflects on it. Henry VIII had bent his realm to crush his sister Mary's legacy, stripping her children of power, humiliating their marriages, destroying Jane Grey, locking Catherine Grey in castles, mocking Mary Grey's love. For generations, the crown had declared that this bloodline would never rule. And yet here it was, walking back down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral, greeted by the thunder of bells and the roar of a nation, binding itself once again to the monarchy. Through Diana, the blood of Mary Tudor flowed into the veins of her sons, William and Harry. Through her, the line of defiance and tragedy, humiliation and love, touched the throne once more. The very blood Henry VIII feared now rests in the heir apparent, Prince William, destined to be king. Consider the poetry of it. Henry VIII declared their children would never bear royal claim. Yet centuries later, that same bloodline will sit upon the throne itself. What had been buried has returned, not in shadow or secrecy, but in full view of the world. Perhaps this is why Diana resonated so deeply. She was never just the people's princess. She was the embodiment of something older, darker, more defiant. The living echo of a girl who once whispered an ultimatum in a Paris chapel. The spiritual heir to Lady Jane Grey, who walked bravely to her death at 17. The sister of Catherine, who loved a man in secret despite the wrath of a queen. The mirror of Mary Grey, who chose love though it meant obscurity. Diana was the circle completed. A story of rebellion, punishment, and survival that had begun 500 years earlier came home in her. In her eyes, the ghosts of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon smiled again. History rarely moves in straight lines. More often, it coils, returns, repeats. A curse becomes a legacy, a punishment becomes defiance, and what was once forbidden becomes inevitable. Through Diana, the Tudors had their revenge. If history's secrets fascinate you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more untold stories.